Hello everyone, and welcome back for a new story. Tonight I take you to two iconic monuments of the world that we all have seen in pictures, but what is the story behind? And how relevant are they to the history of the land where they were built? So first we will go to India and explore the Taj Mahal, probably the most extraordinary mausoleum ever built, at least the most famous. And after that, we will go to the south of Egypt and discover Abu Simbel, a site with two massive temples carved in rock more than 3,000 years ago, during the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses II, which will also give us a chance to talk about his time and his life. So before we begin, please make yourself comfortable and let the tension go in your shoulders. We have a lot to discover tonight. Please also subscribe, comment, and like this episode. It really helps with the algorithm. And if you wish to have more of this channel or support it, please consider joining my Patreon page, where you will find dozens and dozens of episodes such as this one, available for download and streaming, with or without background sounds, together with updates, surveys, and advanced releases. And now, let's head to our first destination, to India, to the Taj Mahal. It is a site that is universally recognized, a majestic white building on a platform topped by domes and surrounded by four high and slender towers, minarets, that punctuate the four corners around the central building, that is at the same time simple in shape and very ornate, with its perfect symmetry and proportions that look right even to people unfamiliar with this style. This mausoleum exudes harmony and balance. The building stands surrounded by gardens and is actually the centerpiece of a larger complex. At first sight, it may look as a palace or possibly a religious building, but it is actually a tomb, the tomb of an empress, in which her husband was later buried too. Her name was Mumtaz Mahal, empress consort of the 5th Mughal Emperor, Shah Jahan. Who were they? What was the Mughal Empire? Where does this exquisite architecture come from? And why did this husband decide to commission such a spectacular monument to his wife? Because there was also a love story behind it. This is what we're going to find out. The Taj Mahal is considered to be the pinnacle, a great achievement of Mughal architecture, which is a style of architecture that flourished especially in the north of India in the 17th century, and drew inspiration from different traditions: Persian, Islamic, Indian, even Turkish, creating an aesthetic called Indo-Islamic. Among other things, its principles include perfect bilateral symmetry, something that tends to be aesthetically pleasing beyond cultural differences. But first, quick tangent. Why is that, by the way? Why do we tend to see beauty and harmony in symmetry? This may have deep roots in humanity, a combination of evolutionary and psychological reasons. Evolutionary biologists argue that in nature, symmetry of bodies is a sign, a clue for health and genetic fitness, because it would indicate organisms that are able to resist disease, parasites. So, as they grow and turn into adults able to reproduce, only individuals with these qualities would retain their symmetry. This is a statistical thing, of course. It doesn't apply systematically to each and every individual. But it's true that across cultures, symmetrical faces tend to be rated more attractive. And this is not limited to humans. Across many species, the preference for symmetry at the time of mating has been tested and validated. It can even extend to other choices. For example, bees statistically prefer symmetrical flowers at the time of harvesting pollen. So this evolutionary or selection bias could be the origin of the appeal. But this is not all. The human brain also processes symmetrical patterns more efficiently. In a sense, symmetry reduces cognitive load. Our visual system recognizes symmetrical patterns easily, and this triggers positive emotions because it feels effortless. This is believed to be a major reason why symmetrical images feel satisfying, calming, orderly. For our brains, they would evoke the pleasure of solving a little puzzle with ease. In architecture, this manifests as a sense of harmony and predictability, which is reassuring, rather than an asymmetrical building that can feel more chaotic and mildly stressful by comparison. Now, it is not an absolute rule. Very often, buildings that are not perfectly symmetrical, but look symmetrical at first sight, may be judged even better if they have little quirks that break the symmetry. Or faces may have details like a mole or an asymmetrical haircut that many will find as or even more attractive because of that. Actually, many works of architecture, from cathedrals that have different statues on each side, or palaces, or urban mansions with a door on the side, may be judged more charming because of these quirks that break the symmetry. And it could be because the general sense of symmetry that feels spontaneously appealing is spiced up a little by details that make it more interesting. And finally, our taste, our aesthetic sensibility, is not something that we are born with. It is also something we acquire. We learn to appreciate things based on what we know. So there is probably a reinforcement mechanism here that draws us to this familiar architecture that we find reassuring, easier to understand and navigate. So, returning to architectural traditions, The Taj Mahal exemplifies the sense of harmony that can be created by symmetry, and it directly draws its general structure and surroundings from a Persian tradition, from what is called a charbagh, a paradise garden, a very orderly and symmetrical space around the central axis, with a design made of water channels and pathways, surrounded with tightly controlled vegetation, a design that symbolizes the rivers of paradise in Islamic tradition. The dome of the building is onion-shaped, which is another Persian influence. The 4 minarets in the corners are typically Islamic. These slender towers were built around the Islamic world, often adjacent to mosques. They served and still serve for the calls to prayer. The term minaret comes from Arabic, manara, which means beacon or lighthouse. And these dedicated towers appeared in the 8th and 9th centuries. It is believed they were influenced by pre-Islamic structures, such as the lighthouse of Alexandria, and also the Mesopotamian ziggurats, these big compounds with different stories or levels, on top of which temples were built, or also Roman and Byzantine victory columns, high and slender monuments that were erected to celebrate military victories. At the early stage of Islam, in the 7th century, the call to prayer was done from rooftops, but in the 9th century, the practice to add one or several minarets to mosques generalized, each region adapting its style to them. And minarets were not limited to mosques. They could also be a symbol of Islamic authority in a place. They could be square, round, and more or less high. An extreme example of high and slender minarets are the ones developed by Ottoman architecture in Turkey. These are pencil-like, with multiple balconies and a sharp, conical roof, a cap, that makes them look rather vertiginous, very vertical. They are actually close contemporary of the Taj Mahal, as they were developed in the 16th and 17th centuries. As Islam spread in India during the Middle Ages, Indian minarets multiplied. The first ones were built in the 12th and 13th centuries, in a precursor state of the Mughal Empire, the Delhi Sultanate, and they blended Persian and Central Asian influences with Indian craftsmanship. They had balconies and intricate inscriptions from the Quran on their surface, and they were often topped in India with a little dome. They kept evolving, and the 4 at the Taj Mahal are regarded as a peak in refinement. The shape stays simple, but they are covered in marble like the rest of the building, and very ornate with details. It doesn't show on pictures, but they are also slightly tilted outward. They lean away from the central mausoleum. This is a safety feature. They are over 40 meters high, that's over 120 feet, and in case of a disaster, like an earthquake or a structural failure, nobody wanted them to fall on the mausoleum. So thanks to the tilt, they would be more likely to fall away from it. But this tilt also creates an optical illusion. From ground level and from typical viewing angles, they still look perfectly vertical thanks to the tilt, which enhances the overall symmetry. The mausoleum is covered in white marble, but even though it doesn't show from afar, the closer you get to it, the more you see intricate geometric motifs and floral patterns made with a technique called pietra dura. Pietra dura means hard stone in Italian. It was called parchinkari in Mughal India, and it consists in creating designs by embedding semi-precious stones that are very precisely cut and polished into a stone base, or in this case a marble base. So it is not painted or filled with some kind of enamel. It is like a stone drawing that uses the colors of different semi-precious stones to create patterns. At the Taj Mahal there are many different types of semi-precious stones, including jasper, lapis lazuli, jade, turquoise or malachite. Some of them come from afar. Lapis was mined in Afghanistan. Jade came from China, or turquoise from Tibet and Persia. The pietra dura technique has ancient roots. The oldest known roots of this technique are to be found in ancient Rome, but there was a revival and a perfectioning of it during the Renaissance, especially in Italy. In particular in the city of Florence, that in the 16th and 17th centuries produced a lot of luxury items using that technique, like panels for walls or tabletops. It was introduced to India, and again, at the Taj Mahal, it reached unprecedented levels of refinement. The colors of different stones are used to mimic the color of vegetation and of different flowers. Typically, artisans had to do a highly precise work. They sketched their design on rock, or marble in that case, and then they carved a shallow recess in the base. After that, they shaped and polished stones to fit perfectly. The technique does not allow for any imperfection or imprecision, otherwise it will look bad. And then the stones were inserted, inlaid, and stuck into the spaces carved for them. It is very minutious and requires a high degree of planning and craftsmanship, especially for such a big monument, because making a tabletop is one thing, but covering the walls of the Taj Mahal was a huge task. We will go inside in a minute and talk of Mumtaz Mahal and Shah Jahan. But first I told you of Mughal architecture and the Mughal Empire. What is this about? The Mughal Empire was founded in the 16th century by an emperor called Babur, a Timurid prince. The Timurids were a dynasty from Central Asia, the descendants of a conqueror called Timur, also called Tamerlane. Their original land was in what is Uzbekistan today. From there, Timur built a vast empire in the 14th century, across Persia, Central Asia, and parts of the Middle East and the north of India. This empire was very influenced by Persian culture, but it was short-lived. After Timur's death in 1405, his empire fragmented into smaller states, all with Muslim rulers, but who were no longer able or willing to expand aggressively like their ancestor had. Until Babur and his conquest of northern India. He established a new dynasty at the head of a state that had its base in the north. A state, an empire that was initially fragile, but that his successors, especially an emperor called Akbar, consolidated and organized in the late 16th century. From there, through war and diplomacy, the Mughal Empire expanded dramatically to much of modern India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Not everything, the southern tip of India or Sri Lanka, were not absorbed. But by the death of Akbar, the empire stretched from Afghanistan to Bengal, Bangladesh today. And the peak of expansion was in the late 17th century. This peak was followed by a quick decline, and in the 18th century the empire fragmented into regional states. The 18th century was also the time when European powers started to intervene more and more in India, taking coastal cities or even conquering bits of India. The Mughal dynasty was already well past its times of splendor at the time, and the final blow happened in 1857 during what is called the Indian Rebellion. The British, that had already expanded their influence in India, exiled the last emperor, which formally ended the dynasty. But the period of the Taj Mahal, the 17th century, under Emperor Shah Jahan, was still a time of magnificence and immense power for the Mughals. Without that, the funding and execution of a marvel such as the Taj Mahal would have been impossible. Shah Jahan, who reigned in the 17th century, was the 5th Mughal emperor. So I told you that the Mughals, the descendants of Babur, were a Muslim dynasty. But they didn't introduce Islam to India. The first introduction of Islam, or the first contact, happened quickly with the rise of the new religion in the 7th century. Arab traders from the Arabic Peninsula traveled on trade routes in the Indian Ocean, and they visited Indian shores, which introduced Islam to trading hubs in India, especially on the southwest coast. But that was still rather marginal. A more significant entry happened by military conquest in the 8th century. The Umayyads, the rulers of the unified Islamic Caliphate, the original Muslim state, that was very expansionist, conquered the south of modern Pakistan, the region of Sindh. This introduced an Arab-ruled province in which Islam spread, but that remained rather isolated from the rest of India. Expansion resumed later, still in the northwest of India, with raids and finally a conquest that gave birth to the Delhi Sultanate in the 13th century, the first major Islamic dynasty in India, ruling much of northern India. At first, they governed mostly non-Muslims. In the Middle Ages, Hinduism was very strongly installed across India. But through conversions and different forms of syncretism, the blending of religious traditions, a significant number of Indians became Muslims in the north. When the Mughals established their empire by conquest, they did it on the ruins of the Delhi Sultanate, and through them Islam remained politically dominant, but never ubiquitous. There was always a coexistence with Hinduism and other religions. Maybe out of conviction, but certainly out of necessity, the Mughals had a policy of tolerance towards non-Muslims, with changes and variations along their history. For example, it hardened by the 18th century. But the religious question, the coexistence of religions, remained a problem for their stability all the time. And there are still echoes, manifestations of this religious question in modern India. It is a source of tensions and sometimes violence. However, even though they had foreign origins, the Mughals became fully Indian, but they introduced the various influences that had shaped their culture, or maintained some of them, because due to history, the influence of Persia, of the Arab world, and Central Asia was already present in the north of India. Now a sign of these influences was Mumtaz Mahal herself, the empress the Taj Mahal was built for. She was born in Agra, India, where the Taj Mahal was built later, but she was born in a family of Persian nobility. Her father was a rich Persian noble who held a high office in the Mughal Empire. Her family was also already close to the imperial dynasty. Her aunt was empress through her marriage to the previous emperor. So in 1612, aged 19, she was married to the prince, the heir, that would become Emperor Shah Jahan. Her name was changed from Arjumand Banu Begum to a title Mumtaz Mahal, which means the exalted one of the palace. This term, Begum, that you may have heard, added to the names of prominent Muslim women in India, is the feminine form of Beg or Bey, meaning lord or chief. So it translates to lady or princess. It is like the English term lady for high-status women. So for her, that was as prestigious as a marriage could be. But she was not destined initially to be the empress, the main consort. A consort in a royal marriage is a spouse that has no right to the throne, should the king or emperor die first. It is less frequent, but there can also be a prince consort, when a man is married to a reigning queen, but without any right to the crown, should she die first. Mughal emperors typically took several wives, and initially, in 1607, when she was 14, she had been promised, betrothed, to the future emperor, to become his main spouse. But ultimately she was demoted to second place, and she became second wife in 1612. Not that the prince disliked her, but these weddings were all political, and the first wife, to whom he had been married earlier, in 1610, 2 years prior, was a princess from the Safavid dynasty, the rulers of Persia at the time. Mumtaz Mahal could not compete with such a prestigious origin, so she became second wife. Shah Jahan also took a third wife in 1617, 5 years later, the daughter of a prominent courtier. So these were the rankings of wives, first, second, and third. But in reality, Shah Jahan really fell in love with Mumtaz Mahal. She became the one love of his life, and he showed little interest in his 2 other wives. He had a daughter with the first one, but no male heir, whereas with Mumtaz Mahal they had 14 children in 19 years of marriage. According to all accounts, this love story was reciprocal, which was rare in arranged marriages. But she remained his constant companion, trusted confidant, forming with the emperor a kind of power couple, cemented by mutual affection, which was very uncommon, not just in India but across the world among royal couples. 7 of their children died at birth or at a very young age, which was unfortunately common at the time. But 7 survived, including the future emperor. Between their marriage and the accession to the throne of Shah Jahan, 16 years of happiness passed. They were married in 1612, and Shah Jahan became emperor in 1628. Once emperor, which he achieved by subduing his half-brother, because successions were generally conflictual and violent. There were rules for them, but the rulers had so many children that pretenders often raised. So after his accession, he promoted Mumtaz Mahal from second wife to chief empress, with the title of Pacha Begum, First Lady or Queen of the Great. And this is when Mumtaz Mahal became empress, aged 35. Only 3 years later, tragedy struck. In 1631, while giving birth to her 14th child, she died, leaving the emperor reportedly inconsolable. It seems that following her death, he went into secluded mourning for a year. And soon the project of a magnificent mausoleum for her, that would become the Taj Mahal, began to take shape. What is a mausoleum, by the way? It is a tomb, or a building constructed to enclose the burial chamber of a deceased person. The archetypal large mausoleum is the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, or was, because it no longer exists. I told you about it in a past episode about the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Actually, the term mausoleum comes from it, the tomb of King Mausolus. A mausoleum can be big or small. In the Roman Empire, relatively small ones were popular among people who could afford them. They were often built in necropoles. In the West and around the Mediterranean, the practice diminished with the rise of Christianity and later Islam. People would generally be buried underground with a relatively simple tombstone. But it had a resurgence during the modern period, 16th, 17th centuries. A mausoleum without the remains of the person inside, which is more a commemorative monument, either because the person was buried somewhere else or their remains were lost. This is called a cenotaph. So the Taj Mahal was commissioned in 1631, and building began the following year, starting with massive works. An area of 3 acres, that's 1.2 hectares, was excavated and filled with dirt to be leveled at 50 meters, 160 feet above the bank of the river nearby. The tomb complex was built mainly using brick and mortar, after which the external surface and the interiors of the main chamber were covered, veneered, with white marble. On top of the marble, 28 different types of precious and semi-precious stone were used, as we saw, to be inlaid into the marble. It is believed that the construction involved more than 20,000 workers, laborers, artisans, painters. The construction was completed 16 years later, in 1648. But around it, to give shape to the complex with pathways, gardens and smaller buildings, work continued for 5 more years. The remains of Mumtaz Mahal were brought there, and Shah Jahan went on to reign until 1658. A 30 years reign in total, of which only 3 were spent with Mumtaz Mahal. In 1658, he was deposed by his own son, again conflictual successions. And after that he was pushed aside, but he lived for another 8 years, until his death in 1666. He was then buried inside the mausoleum too, next to his wife. In the following decades, the Mughal Empire went on, and even expanded more, ensuring the preservation of the Taj Mahal. But things went south for the Mughals in the 18th century, and the mausoleum progressively fell into disrepair. Some of its ornaments, such as chandeliers, were also stolen. In the convulsions of Indian history and the arrival of British rule, the Taj Mahal kept deteriorating until the late 19th century, when the British Viceroy in India ordered a restoration project, which was completed in 1908. The gardens were modified too. They were replaced with European-style lawns that are still in place today. But the original mausoleum itself returned to its past splendor. In 1983, it was designated by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. And since the 20th century, it has turned into a tourist destination that draws millions every year. Rather than tourism, the main threat to it today is air pollution that tends to make it turn yellowish, prompting the government to strictly control emissions of particles in a perimeter around it. But despite being a remain of a long-gone empire and time period, in a more and more industrialized country, and despite the crowds, it retains its sense of harmony and perfection, thanks to the refinement and sense of balance, also the inspiration that Mughal architecture, with its blend of styles and traditions, had reached in the 17th century. It also testifies of the magnificence of the Mughal Empire and of the undying love of an emperor for his wife. The night is still young, and we have more things to discover. So now we're going to travel back much farther in time and go to the very south of Egypt, to Nubia, where another remarkable site awaits us. Abu Simbel, the most famous and spectacular architectural trace left by Ramesses II. This is another site you have seen in pictures, even if you didn't know what it's called. On either side of a monumental door are 4 colossal statues of a pharaoh, Ramesses II, 20 meters or 60 feet high, seated on a throne. Next to his legs are smaller statues depicting his wife, Nefertari, actually one of his many wives, but she was certainly his favorite, and the highest ranked among them. She was depicted in many places in Egypt during the time of Ramesses II's reign. There are also statues of Ramesses' mother, Mutui, his first 2 sons, and his first 6 daughters. It is like a family portrait. The statues and entrance were all cut into a mountain, and so was the interior, entirely dug. If we pass the entrance, we arrive in a hall which is almost square, 18 meters or 59 feet long, and 17 meters wide, 56 feet, with 8 huge pillars depicting Ramesses himself, but deified under the form of Osiris, the god that ruled over the dead, but was also god of fertility, resurrection, and life, which symbolizes the everlasting nature of the pharaoh. Everywhere on the walls are depicted battles in which Ramesses II triumphed, in bas-relief, that is to say, carved, with a small recess in the rock, including the Battle of Kadesh. We will come back to it. From this hall, one can continue into a second pillared room with scenes of offerings to gods and depictions of Ramesses and Nefertari. This hall gives access to yet another smaller room with 4 seated statues. These are the 3 gods the temple was dedicated to, that were the 3 main deities worshipped in Egypt at the time. Ra, god of the sun, which had the center of his cult in the city of Heliopolis, Ptah, the creator god and patron of artisans and architects, from the city of Memphis, and Amun from Thebes. Among them, and of the same size, sits the deified Ramesses II. 300 feet from this larger main temple, dedicated to Ramesses and his three gods, is a smaller one, dedicated to goddess Hathor and Nefertari. It also has colossal statues, 6 of them on the facade, that is also rock cut. These ones are more than 30 feet high, representing the king flanked by the queen. The inside is relatively small, but also richly decorated with bas-relief and statues on pillars. We are at the very south of modern Egypt, near the frontier with Sudan, and to the ancient Egyptians too. This location was very far south. It was actually in Nubia, a large land to the south that the Egyptians often dominated along their history, and that provided them gold together with other precious goods like ivory, ebony, or ostrich feathers. But this was not a random choice to build such a pair of temples. Ramesses II had a policy of influence, and we could say Egyptianization, in Nubia. He wished to demonstrate the might of Egypt and its magnificence to the Nubians, which historically had had a tendency to revolt very regularly along the centuries. So apart from an extensive building program in Egypt itself, he commissioned spectacular temples in Nubia, temples that would be beacons of Egyptian influence and culture. The construction of these 2 ones lasted 20 years and happened by the middle of the 13th century BC. But who was Ramesses? Why is he one of the most famous pharaohs of ancient Egypt? And what was his kingdom like at the time? This is what we need to discuss in order to understand Abu Simbel. Ramesses II, also called Ramesses the Great, was a pharaoh of the New Kingdom, the last period of prosperity and unity in the very long history of Egypt. It lasted from the 16th to the 11th centuries BC. And at the time, Egypt was probably at its peak, ever, when it came to wealth, domination of its neighbors, and military might. Ramesses was not destined, at birth, to be a pharaoh. He was the grandson of a vizier, a kind of prime minister of the last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, a pharaoh called Horemheb. Horemheb appointed his vizier as his successor, and with him, historians date the end of the 18th dynasty. About these Egyptian dynasties, they were not how ancient Egyptians classified their sovereigns. The structuring in dynasties was introduced later, first by Greek historians. So sometimes these dynasties do not exactly correspond to a biological line of succession. For example, Horemheb, the last one of the 18th dynasty, was put there, but he was unrelated to pharaohs of that dynasty, except for his marriage to a queen that came from it. So, after him, a new dynasty starts, the 19th. First with Ramesses I, the grandfather, who became pharaoh when the future Ramesses II was 7. Then his father, Seti I, and after that Ramesses ascended to the throne, aged 24. But he went on to live and reign for 66 years. An extraordinarily long reign and life for the time. He died at 90 or 91, staying on the throne longer than any other pharaoh, save maybe for a pharaoh of the 6th dynasty, from the Old Kingdom, Pepi II, who is said to have died at 100 and reigned for 90 years, because he was crowned as a child. In any case, Ramesses II rose to power at a time when, internally, Egypt was in rather good shape, but had lost some of its conquests to the Nubians in the south and to the Hittites in the Levant in the Middle East. Fighting against the Hittites would be one of the great endeavors of the first 2 decades of his reign. The Hittites were a people and a civilization, with its center in Anatolia, in modern Turkey. They unified inside an empire centered on a capital, Hattusa, and they became one of the great powers of the Middle East by the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. And they came into conflict with other Middle Eastern great powers, the Assyrians from Mesopotamia and the Egyptians. During the New Kingdom, Egypt had expanded by conquest to the shores of the eastern Mediterranean. The Egyptians had subdued the people from the Levant, and this clashed with the ambitions of the Hittites. So early on, Ramesses embarked on different military campaigns and built up the largest army Egypt had ever had, estimated to 100,000 men. He could do that because Egypt was wealthier than ever, with a population of millions and the productive agriculture along the Nile that had guaranteed its prosperity for so many centuries already. Overall, he was very successful in his campaigns. He subdued the Nubians again. He crushed pirates that attacked the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, and went on to campaign in the Levant against the Hittites. This culminated in 1274 BC at one of the great battles of antiquity, the Battle of Kadesh, a place that is today near the border of Lebanon and Syria. The numbers are always hard to prove, but the battle involved tens of thousands and started horrible for Ramesses, because even though his forces were more numerous, he was personally outmaneuvered and surrounded. Military commanders like him would not just follow a battle from afar. They threw themselves into the battle at the head of their troops. At the time, on chariots that dominated battlefields of this period on the flat plains and deserts of the Middle East. The Battle of Kadesh is also thought to be the largest battle of chariots ever, with 2,000 ones on the side of the Hittites, each carrying 2 men, a driver and a bowman or a fighter, and 2,500 on the Egyptian side. Despite the tricky situation he found himself into, Ramesses managed to charge with his bodyguards and break the encirclement, which avoided capture or death, and the battle went on undecisively. It ended in a stalemate, a draw, and Ramesses withdrew temporarily. Though this was not really a victory, but given the scope of the battle, the fact that he had showed great courage and turned the situation around, escaping and rallying his troops, Ramesses turned this undecisive battle into a great victory in his propaganda. The depictions of the battle on the walls of the hall at Abu Simbel is an illustration of that. But still, overall Ramesses was a successful military leader. Most of his campaigns were victorious, and he effectively secured the frontiers. In the year 21 of his reign, he signed a peace treaty with the Hittites that put an end to the long conflict with them. Before that, early in his reign, he had initiated the most ambitious building program by a pharaoh in Egypt, probably ever, which reflects the fact that building for pharaohs was a way of leaving a trace, but also to demonstrate power. They showed with the monuments they commissioned, or sometimes restored or improved, for example adding elements to existing temples, how powerful and rich Egypt was, and that they used their power to cover the country in marvels. All the monuments, temples, chapels, obelisks, tombs would also serve as propaganda support to praise them, celebrate their triumphs, real or a bit exaggerated when needed. And so for any pharaoh since the Old Kingdom, an ambitious building activity was a must. Ramesses II just pushed it to an extreme, due to the means he had, to his ambitions, and the duration of his reign that gave him decades to build always more. And the largest work he ordered was actually not Abu Simbel, it was the creation of a new capital. Since the beginning of the New Kingdom, the capital had been in the south, in Thebes, because this is where the rulers of the 17th and 18th dynasties that reconquered and reunified Egypt at the beginning of the New Kingdom came from. Ramesses decided to change this. We don't exactly know his motives, but it could be because he was aware that Egypt needed to project itself more if it was to retain its possessions in the Levant. And having the capital placed so far south of the delta of the Nile, the Mediterranean and its trade routes, and the Levant, was not a sound strategic choice for what Egypt had become. So we don't exactly know why he takes this decision, but he orders the political capital to be moved to an entirely new site called Pi Ramesses, Domain of Ramesses, in the east of the delta of the Nile. That is to say, close to the Sinai Desert, the gateway to the Levant. Very little remains of it. It was abandoned 200 years later, but it remained a capital for decades. It had large temples and palaces, surrounded by storehouses, docks, and military facilities. Everything a pharaoh could need to quickly gather an army and go on a campaign in the Mediterranean or the Levant. Ramesses did not fully abandon Thebes neither, which remained probably the largest religious center in Egypt. This is where the cult of Amun was installed, and generations of pharaohs had built their tombs and funerary temples there. A funerary temple was a temple dedicated to the cult of a pharaoh. They were deified. They were seen as half-gods, so that, including after their death, the cult would go on. So in Thebes, that the Egyptians called Waset, Thebes is the Greek name of the city. In Thebes, he spent lavishly on existing temples, like the complex of Karnak, and also commissioned his own funerary temple, called the Ramesseum. Very little remains of this temple, but in the 13th century BC, it used to be one of the largest temples of Egypt. And yet another great achievement is Abu Simbel, where we began, that he traveled to in 1255 BC to inaugurate the temples with his main wife, Nefertari. When he died, around 90, he had survived many of his wives and children, so much so that his 12 first sons had died of disease or old age before him. And his successor was his 13th son, a pharaoh called Merneptah, who had a more ordinary reign of 10 years. A mummy attributed to Ramesses II with a good grade of certainty was discovered, and it informed Egyptologists first of his high stature for the time, and also confirmed he had died very old. When he died in 1213 BC, the good times were not over for Egypt. The kingdom would go on to dominate its neighbors and enjoy a certain prosperity for a few more generations, before decline really began in the 11th century BC. Even when he was still alive, Ramesses II already started to turn into a legend. There were the victories, the buildings, the unusual duration of his reign that must have made people wonder whether he was not immortal. And also the cult. I told you about funerary temples that were built to worship past pharaohs. But Ramesses went further. He was worshipped as he was still alive. He posed as a god himself. This is reflected on many monuments he had modified, restored, or built, including at Abu Simbel, where he is represented deified and sitting among the gods as an equal to them. Abu Simbel was inaugurated 40 years before the end of his reign. He left such a mark that 11 more pharaohs would use the name Ramesses after him. One of them, Ramesses III, was also a quite successful king. The last Ramesses reigned by the end of the New Kingdom, at a time when the power of pharaohs was diminishing. But the story of Abu Simbel does not end there. What happened at the site after the death of Ramesses? It is likely that the temples continued to function as sites of worship in the late New Kingdom, at least for some time. But we have no evidence of what happened, as Egypt lost again its control of Nubia. And at some point, we don't exactly know when, the temples were abandoned. The site was in the desert, so bit by bit, year after year, sand piled up around the monuments, the two temples, and the site faded from widespread knowledge in antiquity. During the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st centuries BC, the Greek period, there is no record of operations at Abu Simbel, nor modifications, not even a mention of it. And this continued during the Roman period. For centuries, the site seems to have been completely forgotten. It is far south and south of Aswan, the largest city in southern Egypt. So it seems only a few travelers and locals could have known its existence. Information from Nubia did not circulate much to the north. So, contrary to other Egyptian temples that were also in the south but close to Aswan, like the temple of Isis, the last of ancient Egyptian temples to close due to the Christianization of Egypt, Abu Simbel completely faded from memories. By the late antiquity, it is likely that sand had now hidden the statues on the facades, despite their sizes, and the two temples remained buried, waiting to be rediscovered. This took centuries. It is only in 1813 that a Swiss explorer spotted the top of the colossal heads of Ramesses and the upper bas-relief of the main temple, barely emerging from the sand. So the sand was slowly removed. The region of Abu Simbel was very remote. It took time. And in 1817, 4 years later, the entrance of the main temple was excavated, allowing explorers and then scholars to discover its interior, very well preserved thanks to the sand and the dry climate. They realized this was one of the greatest monuments of ancient Egypt, and the connection to Ramesses II was quickly made with the abundant iconography, the walls, the statues. The entire site is a celebration of the man who wanted to be worshipped as a god. In the 20th century, the site became endangered when the project to build a dam in the south of Egypt, a dam on the Nile, the Aswan Dam, was proposed as a way to not only produce electricity in the south of Egypt, which badly needed this, but also regulate the floods of the Nile. In antiquity, these floods were a blessing because they irrigated the banks of the Nile and covered them in sediments that fertilized the soil over and over, year after year. But in industrial times, with fertilizers and also the growing density of population along the Nile, it became a danger, a hazard. The problem was that the building of the dam would create an artificial lake that would submerge the temples some of the most remarkable remains of the Egyptian civilization. So in the 1960s, an ambitious project was imagined, dismantling very carefully the temples and relocating them higher and 200 meters away from the future lake. It sounds like a titanic task, but the site was worth it, and it was completed between 1964 and 1968. An artificial hill was created where 16,000 blocks cut from the temples were transported and reassembled, including preserving the alignment at the entrance with the rising sun. As the original site was cut on the side of a mountain, an artificial mountain that closely resembles the original was built behind the facade to cover the rooms inside. And this lets visitors see the site as it was before relocation, on the side of a cliff. This is what historians and tourists can see today. The same temples, made of the same stone blocks, but relocated to a safer location, higher. So that when the Aswan Dam was built and the artificial lake created, Lake Nasser, Abu Simbel wasn't lost. This is the end of our stories for tonight. If you are not sleepy yet, you may pick another one in my library and embark on another adventure. Or you may keep your eyes shut, let yourself go, and fall asleep. I'll be back soon with a new episode, and in the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.